Sup y'all, it's me, it's your boy Asmongold, and today I want to talk to you guys about the recent Q&A that happened yesterday between Laura, who's one of the community managers, and Ian Azacostas, who's the game director for World of Warcraft. Now, in this Q&A, there was nothing like crazy or grandiose that came out, right? I think in the last one they accidentally said that the Tomb of Sargeras was going to be the next raid, and people obviously went apeshit about that. There was nothing like that that came out in this Q&A, but at the same time, in a way, this Q&A was very, very important because it discussed a lot of core gameplay, everyday mechanics, and how Blizzard is looking at those and how they planned on changing them in regards to secondary stats, gearing, legendaries, raid release schedules, things that basically everybody's actually going to be dealing with, but they're not necessarily as salacious as like seeing about the new raid or something crazy like that. So I'm very, very glad about that. I'm really always glad whenever they make these Q&As and they do these. I always like watching them. It's always funny like doing them, like listening to them on stream and like live reacting to them. And so I'm always really, really glad whenever they do. So I do really, really appreciate that they are doing these. But anyway, guys, let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing, obviously, is that ever since Trial of Valor came out, people have been wiping on it all the time. And Trial of Valor is intended to be kind of a continuation in difficulty from Emerald Nightmare. So as an example, you would go through like normal Emerald Nightmare, and then after you finish normal Emerald Nightmare, you would maybe do normal Trial of Valor. So Odin would be hypothetically more difficult than Xavius. Now I think Xavius is a little bit harder. Odin isn't really that hard, but Gwarm, or maybe especially Helya, is going to be more difficult than any other fight in the Emerald Nightmare. Now with that, people are wondering like, well, why are these fights so much harder? And they just reward gear that's like 5 item levels higher. It's not really that well itemized. It doesn't look cool, and it doesn't have like all these crazy stats like you have with gear in Karazhan. So what Ian said basically is that they're going to be buffing the item level of all of the gear in Trial of Valor by 5 item levels. This is going to be happening next week, which is awesome. I'm glad about that. Now, there have also been a lot of concerns that Trial of Valor is like too hard. Now, in my opinion, I think that the only fight that is actually mechanically, there's a lot of mechanics and everything. And I know this might surprise a lot of people, but I do think that Odin is one of the fights that has a ton of different mechanics in terms of the movement with the tornadoes, especially in the last phase. And I think they could tune that down a little bit. And also it just seems to be too long. I don't really think that Trial of Valor is too hard. I think Gwarm is a perfect Patrick fight. I love it. Helya is probably one of the best fights that they've ever made. I love the Helya fight. I think it's amazing. There's so much different stuff going on. The scaling from different difficulties works very well. So I'm very happy about Trial of Valor and its difficulty. And fortunately for me, so is Blizzard. So there's not really going to probably nerf too many things out of Trial of Valor. I think they might nerf 1 or 2 things. But for the most part, it's going to be staying the same and just be getting that buff in item level, which is awesome. Now, they also talk about patch 7.2, which is whenever the Tomb of Sargeras is coming out. And there are a lot of people who that Blizzard thinks are still going to be working on Nighthold. So whenever 7.2 comes out, there's not that Nighthold, sorry, not Nighthold, Tomb of Sargeras is not going to be coming out at the exact same time as 7.2. It's going to be very similar to a lot of the raids that we've gotten. Whenever Legion came out, it's not like the raids came out on the same day. 7.2 is going to be the same thing, so people can kind of ease into the content, just so they don't like overwhelm people with the content and then they don't do everything. I think that just by releasing it in parts, they kind of prolong the amount of content that they have, because people just play the shit out of that part of the content, then they put out a new piece and they play the shit out of that part of the content. Whereas if they put out all of it, people pick and choose and they just end up not doing certain things. So I think this is probably a good idea. Now, they also compared this to 6.2, where they said that 6.2 releasing Hellfire Citadel was not really a good idea to release whenever 6.2 came out, because a lot of people were still working on BRF. Now, while I think that that is kind of true, because I remember this, I think that really a better example would be Heimdall. I think that BRF was introduced way too early. I think Heimdall could have still been out for another like month or two, and people could have still progressed through it and everything. But BRF, I think that for the most part, it was cut a little short, right? And I think that of like the history of the game, like the most the tier that was cut short the most was Ulduar, right? Whenever Trial of the Crusader came out, Ulduar gear basically became irrelevant minus like a couple of pieces. and most people were still progressing on Old War normal mode and weren't even finished doing weren't even beginning to do the hard modes. So it was really good to see them, I guess, like being mindful of that. And I think that, a lot of people would compare this to people look at Burning Crusade and they say that, Black Temple was released before anybody even killed Kel'Thuzad. So you couldn't even get into Black Temple whenever they put it out. But I think the real difference that we're going to look at here is that it's an unfortunate one, and one that I'm not really a big fan of, but it's reality right now, is that there are a lot of different raid difficulties. And usually throughout the expansions, whenever a new raid difficulty comes out or a new raid comes out, the lower raid difficulty of that raid compared to like the higher raid difficulty, so like heroic of like the new raid would be the same equivalent kind of as mythic of the old raid. So you would go and do heroic and it would be a lot easier because it's only heroic, and then you would take that gear and then clear out mythic, and there would be significantly less of a challenge. So I think that really with the amount of raid difficulties and Titan forging and everything like that, releasing them in this way is probably a better idea, but I do think that HFC probably came out at a pretty decent time, but I think that BRF did come out a little bit early too. Now for 7.3, this is whenever we're going to be going to Argos. Argos is the Draenei homeworld, I believe, and this is kind of like the home base of the Burning Legion, right? So, Burning Legion invades Azeroth all the time, they're assholes, so we're finally in 7.3 going to be coming back and actually attacking them in their homeworld, which is awesome. Now, some people thought that they accidentally released or announced a new expansion in 7.3. Argus, they could have something to do with the next expansion after Legion, but Argus 7.3 is a patch, not an expansion. It's not going to have a leveling process. It's just going to be an outdoor zone with outdoor quests, probably new world quests, maybe a daily quest hub, and at some point, the new raid, which is probably going to be the last raid in Legion. They said that Legion is going to be a 3-tier expansion, so obviously you're going to have like Nighthold, and then Tomb of Sargeras, and then whatever the Argus raid is going to be. And I don't really know what's going to happen after that. They might release like some kind of Trial of Valor raid after that, but I don't really expect that's going to happen either. Now, also, there were a lot of people that are asking questions about stats. People are not very happy, and it doesn't feel good to get like an 880 or an 875 ring, and your 845 ring with a socket, and your best stats is still better than that. So Blizzard is going to be kind of changing the way that they do stats on rings and necklaces. So at the beginning of Legion and before that, they talked about basically evening out and lessening the exponential curve that players get whenever, as they progress through the expansion with their secondary stats. So in, like, let's say Cataclysm or any of the expansions before Legion, you would start out as, like, let's say a Fury Warrior with 10% crit at the beginning of the expansion with, like, very, very bad gear. And throughout the expansion and at best in slot in-game raid gear, your crit chance would be like 50%. Well, in Legion, they wanted to lessen that gap between a very, very high-geared player and a very, very low-geared player. And I think this is a good idea. This is a good idea. They were doing that. I said that then, and I still think that. So now in Legion, whenever you're lower geared, you'd have like maybe 25% crit, and whenever you're higher geared, you have like 40, right? So there is less of a gap between the two, and also the stats never reach that like insane point that they usually do at the end of the expansions. Now, obviously, that's always really fun to do. I don't really know how I feel about them taking that out, because I think it's kind of like a reward of like finishing all the raid stuff, but we'll see what happens. I think that probably it'll get to that point in one way or another at the end of the expansion anyway. But anyway, the secondary stats, you're looking at balancing secondary stats. So like if you're a Fury Warrior or like a Arms Warrior, like crit sucks, right? But they want to make crit and all these other stats a little bit better for all of the specs, so players don't really feel like even though they get a really, really big itemable upgrade for a ring, it still just doesn't matter because it doesn't have the right secondary stats. So Blizzard is going to be going back to the old scaling model for just the rings and the necklaces in terms of how they scale exponentially, and at least at a much higher level. I don't really think exponentially is the right word, but at a much higher level than the other gear in terms of how many secondary stats you get from them. So basically the rings and the necklaces are going to have more secondary stats. They're going to scale to have even more throughout the expansion, to where players feel like if an item is, and this is kind of like the example they use, if an item is 15 item levels higher than the item that you're replacing, the item that you're, the 15 item level higher item would always be better than the original one, which is obviously something that I think is a good idea. As I said, I think it's kind of sucks. Like I have like 5 or 6 875 or 880 rings in my bags, and I never use them because they're just not very worthwhile. Now, also, artifact appearances. People have had a lot of questions about like what are going to happen with artifact appearances in Legion is over, and obviously it's just begun, so they don't really have all this planned out, but their plan right now is to be able to allow players to, if they've gotten the appearances during Legion, they're going to be able to transmog those appearances onto new weapons after Legion. But if they didn't get them, they can still obtain those appearances from the Legion content and use those appearances on their artifact weapons then, but they can't necessarily use those appearances on new items after Legion. They can't transmog those appearances on items that are not artifact weapons, if that makes sense. So I think that's actually a very, very good way of handling it, and a lot of the things that they've been doing in here make a lot of sense. And another thing, people have obviously been wondering about like Battlegrounds. Like, there haven't been any real new Battlegrounds. They revamped what was it, Blades Edge Mountains, they're going to be, and then they also did in Grand Arena, and then they added, I think, one or two new arenas in Legion, but there haven't been any new Battlegrounds since Deepwind Gorge. I think it's the last one. That was in like Pandaria, right? So people are kind of wondering about that. There's not going to be any new Battlegrounds right now. They're thinking, because like they're doing the thing in 7.1.5, I think it's 7.2, I don't remember really which one, but where they're going to have like a Winter Alterac, Winter Arathi Basin, so like your visibility is very limited. You can only see things that are very close in front of you, and just to kind of switch things up and kind of make more content out of something that's already in the game, they're adding the South Shore versus Hillsbred scenario thing that they had for the 10th anniversary back in as kind of a weekly event, like kind of the way that you have like the time walking events. I think this is going to be basically the same thing. And if they do add more Battlegrounds, they've been floating the idea of potentially kind of cycling Battlegrounds, and so like one day or 1 week or whatever, you'd be doing like these 5 Battlegrounds, and the next week you'd be doing another 5. So some weeks certain Battlegrounds wouldn't really be available, I guess. Now personally, I don't really think this is a good idea. I think what they should do instead of that, instead of cycling through them, is they should just make the like one weekend will be a bonus event for a certain Battleground, or 1 week will be a bonus event for a certain Battleground, and kind of not necessarily take content away, but incentivize other types of content. I think that'll be the best way of handling it. Now, of course, this has been a big question ever since the system was announced, and while some of the things that they've been doing have made sense, I really cannot make sense out of the way that they're doing this legendary system. At the beginning, they said they would let you target legendaries. There's still, because there were questions about legendaries, that's what I'm talking about, there still is not going to be anything that's going to allow you to target legendaries that has been announced yet. And also, there's not going to be any changes, to the best of my knowledge, as to how the legendary items are going to drop. There's not going to be any more deterministic system for completing harder content or something like that. So that was a huge disappointment for me. I really don't like the legendary system at all, and this is coming from somebody that has 3 legendaries. So I don't like it. I think that they should change it. When everybody, almost, not everybody, but it seems like all the feedback that I get from the legendary system whenever I make a video about it or talk about it is people agreeing and people who are frustrated with the system. So I don't really know why they're so intent on keeping the system, and I think it's detrimental to the game. And the reason for that, and they talk about like utility legendaries are like sometimes more useful than damage legendaries, and some of the legendaries are going to get nerfed, like the Pyroblast bracers for mages, I think that's an example, and the Unholy bracers, and they're going to add new legendary items and everything like this. And I think that in a lot of ways, because Ian is he's a hard, or at least he was, or used to be, a hardcore in-game raider that played with his guild, right? And I think that perspective is also a perspective that I've had too, but it wasn't really that long ago, at least in my mind, that I was pugging raids and doing things in just different, I guess like less organized content where people don't really have that understanding that, oh, this guy is really good, or he was good, like, before they made this change, so this is a good player, he just doesn't have this legendary. And I think that in a lot of ways, they're kind of oblivious to the effects that these legendary systems and these like utility legendaries don't necessarily translate over and create a good community for pug raiding, which is what I think a lot of players actually do. Most players don't raid with their guild. Most players raid with pugs, or they do LFR, or any sort of like content that they're doing that doesn't necessarily involve like a queuing system. Most of them are doing that without a guild. So I think that whenever you look at that and you have like pugs like looking for people that have very high item level, or a certain amount of legendaries, or be able to meet a certain DPS requirement, Sorry if that is loud. I have no idea really why. But anyway, I think that those issues are very, very important, and the legendary system and the Titan Forging and the utility legendaries don't really translate over to being the same usefulness in those pug raids, and I think that Blizzard really should look at doing something to help those players, because I think they're a very huge majority of people who just raid in pugs or something like that. But anyway, guys, that's pretty much all I have to say about the legendaries. I've talked about that a million times, and I think that, the way that they're looking at this, I think they're looking at it from a guild perspective, and they should look at it from a broader perspective for like pug raiding, and the way that the emergent gameplay and emergent behavior that comes out of these legendaries, and how I think it can be toxic to players who basically just get unlucky. Now, what is kind of good is that obviously some of these legendaries do suck. On Tuesday, all legendaries are getting buffed up to item level 9, 10. So that's awesome for me. That's really awesome for me. It seems like if I didn't have any legendaries, I'd be mad, dude. I'd be so fucking mad, because it's like the rich get richer, right? You got 2 legendaries, you just got like another 30 item levels added onto your gear. So I don't know, man. Like, I don't know, like, if this is like the right call. But in 7.1, they did a system to where, like, if you they increased the chance for somebody to get a legendary if they didn't already have one. So that's good. We'll have to see what happens. I just really hope they add in more, like, newer ways to get these items. That's basically what it comes down to. 7.2, they talked about at the beginning of Legion, they talked about increasing the amount of legendaries that people can equip. That's not going to happen in 7.2. You're probably still going to be able to equip 2 legendaries. Maybe in 7.3 you'll be able to equip 3. We'll have to see. The quick join system that they recently added, it's a thing that, like, is like some guy, if you have like your default UI or default chat frame, it'll have like the little thing with like your friends list, and it'll have like the little bell, and then it'll come like, oh, so and so has joined, like the random arena queue or random battlegrounds or LFR, and so you can queue up with that person. I think this is a great system. I don't really know why they didn't do that earlier. It can be annoying for some people because it keeps popping up, and it doesn't let you use your friends list whenever it's popped up, and they're basically going to be disabling that or making that less annoying, which is great. Now, also, they talked about this at BlizzCon, and they were talking about increasing the base item level of dungeons, and that's probably going to happen in 7.2 or 7.3, where basically they're going to be increasing the item level of all dungeons. So right now, heroic dungeons drop item level 825 gear, and after whatever this change is going to be, whenever it happens, normal dungeons are going to be dropping 825 gear, and my assumption is probably heroic dungeons are going to be dropping 840. So it's going to be like raising the item level on all these dungeons, and the only real problem that I kind of see with this potentially happening is it's going to increase the repetition of doing these dungeons over and over. So right now, whenever you hit max level, you don't really need to do normal mode dungeons, and so you only really need to repeat the dungeons twice, and most people don't even do the heroics, they just do world quests to get the gear. So in that way, I kind of feel that it might not really be good for new players to feel compelled to repeat the same content 3 times in a row whenever now they only have to do it twice. But we'll have to see what other catch-up mechanisms they have and how those are going to augment the process. Now, bonus roll coins are also probably, if they fail, they're probably going to give you artifact power soon. There's apparently some sort of programming issue, which is why they haven't done that before. They talked about... Excuse me. They talked about some underperforming classes, I think Elemental Shamans and Brewmaster Monks. Now, I don't play either one of those, so I don't really know what position they're in. Ian basically said that Elemental Shamans perform very well on AoE situations, but because there aren't really any more AoE fights in the game right now, they don't really have a place to shine. And Brewmaster Monks are very good, it's just apparently nobody knows that. So I don't really know how to feel about that. It's kind of funny, and in a way it's kind of good, in a way. That like the game designer, game director is just like, yo, just get good. I think that in some ways he probably should say that to different groups of players. I think you guys can guess which ones that I mean. But ultimately, I think that maybe they should buff those things, buff the classes up a little bit to make them a little bit more. At least like make players feel like they're better without necessarily making them better. I don't know how to do that, but I think that's probably something that they could look into. But anyway, guys, that's pretty much everything that was going over in the Q&A. As you guys can see, there's a lot of stuff that I kind of wanted to unpack and talk about. Many of the things that were talked about in this Q&A were core gameplay issues that people will experience on a day-to-day basis with like the legendary items, as I said, the secondary stats, the raids, the utilities, the quick join and stuff. So all of these things are very, very important, which is why I wanted to go over them. I do apologize. I don't know how long this video. Oh my god, this is kind of a long video. I do apologize, but hopefully it wasn't too boring. Hopefully you guys got something out of it, and hopefully we'll see things improve from here. All good news. I'm happy about everything besides the legendary thing, and so hopefully they'll do something, but we'll see. Anyway guys, that's pretty much all I got. So thanks for watching, and like, comment, subscribe.